Hey everyone, it's Erin with Counter Read, joined by Brandon, also of Counter Read, and we are here to talk about a 13-10 loss for Nebraska to Iowa. The Heroes Trophy is going back to Iowa City. I don't even honestly, I don't really know where to begin. So Brandon, I'm going to ask one how you are, and then two, what are just some initial thoughts that you have?
Yeah, I'm doing well. Uh, even though we kind of everyone talked all week that 13-10 game seemed very much in line with what both these teams were capable of, but also it's kind of been the last, I think, 4 games that Iowa has played. Um, Still, when you watch it unfold with every twist and turn included, it doesn't help make it less painful if you're a Nebraska fan because of just it was that again. We've seen a bunch of close losses, one score losses. To get three on basically field goals as time expired may have been. Who knew there was yet another level of disappointing to that, but I think there'll be plenty of time and a lot to break down with this 2023 football season. Once we get past it, it's all pretty raw right now, but it'll be it'll be interesting to see what we can see. I'm actually pretty interested to dig into it because on surface level, you could say felt like a lot of the past seasons.
Yeah, I think this was a game where when you look at like Iowa, if Iowa is the Big Ten West champ, they became the Big Ten West champ prior to this matchup. So this really in the they wanted to win. I'm not implying that they didn't, but they had, really secured that, sealed that up for themselves. So this was really more, I'd say, gravy on top of it at this point. And yeah, the biggest thing that I kind of think about this is that Iowa has kind of shown that it just can win despite all other things. Now, we obviously know they're going to be going through an offensive coordinator change in the offseason, but even despite just kind of the turmoil around that and the strong feelings one way or the other around it, they just seemingly, because I mean, I'm just looking at the box score of today, and, Iowa had 257 total yards, Nebraska's 264, but they only had 94 pass yards. That's pretty standard. They're not a pass heavy team. They tend to try to run the ball, so that's where they put their attention. But even that wasn't significant. I mean, 163 rushing yards, yet they still walked away with the win. I think Iowa is just, and Rule said a little bit of this at the post game press conference, but we know this. Iowa knows who it is, for better or worse. Iowa knows who it is. I would say Nebraska is trying to figure out who it is, and that's partially why I think when I've seen some of the comments that this feels like a Scott Frost team or a whatever team prior to now, I think a little bit of that is because this is still a Nebraska team trying to figure out who it is. And we said this, I said this in our game day chat when someone was like, how are you feeling at this point? And I was like, I still think you can make the case that there was improvement, but there's a lot of areas that are going to have to be sincerely addressed. And actually, I'm really, really particularly interested in play calling and time management, because both of those, especially once again against Iowa, which we've seen this in other matchups, were not particularly strong. I would say it was, even when Matt Rule made the comment about, Tristan Alvano didn't come out for that, 60-yard field goal. I think it was 57-yard field goal attempt. And he said, well, I had a fake drawn up. Sir, you are kicking into the wind with your freshman kicker who hasn't been, who's had a tough freshman season, to be, quite frank. What are we calling here? So like there's things where I think that's a call that you make when Nebraska knows who it is. And I question that call now. And so anybody watching this could be, well, then why didn't you push further on it? Why didn't you ask more about it? And I think these are questions that are going to have to be asked when there's time to sit and absorb them and have film watched, because typically these post-game question and answers are not going to be the most in-depth. I do think there will be a time and a place to ask more of these specifics. But yeah, that was one for me where I'm like, does Iowa really think does Iowa really think you're kicking it at that point, or are they also in on this is probably a fake idea based on just the setup of it? So again, a couple of the areas that I'm particularly interested in, especially going into the off season and how they are going to work to fix them or address them, is play calling and time management. At least that's where I'm at right now.
Yeah, I think those will remain the two big ones over the long, 9 months ahead. Gosh, it hurts to say, but it'll be a while before we see Nebraska play football again. The time management piece of it'll be interesting, and I agree with you. I think Rule will be a little more up for this conversation in the off season. When they've done their own kind of like nose to tail look back at the year that was. Changing clock rules, like, I'm not making an excuse at all. Like, I look at it, and I thought this during that final timeout that Nebraska had to use when it really couldn't use one. And we know what Rule's explanation was. It was like young receivers, they weren't lined up right, all these things. But I'm also just kind of like, he came straight from the NFL. Which college rules are now more like what the NFL was, but it just felt like one of those things that they didn't have a feel for, which is strange. And when you end up one game short of bowl eligibility on 3 walk-off field goals, it stings a little bit extra. Play calling piece of it, that'll be another kind of all off season long, I think, topic that people will be talking about. Nebraska just didn't seem to have a lot of rhythm in all types of games, and I was very good defensively. We all know that, but so is Nebraska, and we'll see there. I'm of the belief Nebraska, they've got some good young players. They do, but I think overall they need a pretty serious upgrade with 4 new teams coming into the Big Ten at the skill positions in particular. So now that stuff that plays into what happened in this game. I mean, this game to me is pretty simple. It's not that different from a lot of the Nebraska games we've seen. My first key in the preview I wrote of this game this week was Nebraska had to at least equal Iowa in special teams. And prior to the missed field goal, I think it was pretty undeniably beating Iowa in special teams. It had the 2 blocks of its own. It had the fumble that Nebraska committed on the punt return, but the punters, Iowa's punters, one of the best in the country, were basically equal until you had that missed field goal. It was probably edge Nebraska, and I think it still might have been pretty much even. You mentioned the yards a little bit in terms of a per play. Nebraska ran about 10 fewer plays, I think, in this game. Nebraska was almost a yard better there. Usually you win when you do that. Matt Rule mentioned post-game they were 8 of 17 on third down, 47%. Iowa was at 33. But they were -2 in turnovers. So here we are again. And that's one that I understand the comparisons to just the close losses and the regime we just watched for the previous 5 seasons. The turnover piece of it's been a problem in Nebraska for a long, long time.
It has. And I don't mean to just pause and when I was sitting on the sideline watching this all sort of played out, I had turned to somebody and said, if Nebraska loses on a field goal, I'm going to just be absolutely just like gobsmacked by that. Not because it wasn't possible, but just because it felt like it shouldn't be what happens, especially when you have the turnover that Nebraska gets. And you think and there's a lot of, it's easy to start placing blame where you could go if Tristan Alvano had made that kick, if Chubba Purdy hadn't had that interception. You can start really kind of doing this thing where you start, trying to place blame on one person over another, or finding things where you're like, yep, this would have happened, or this would happen. We've said this in the past, and I think this is where it really comes down to it for me, is like, this is a team that just can't it's not at a place yet where it can overcome those little, and those aren't little errors. Those are big errors. But I'm saying In a different scenario, for a team that maybe knows a little bit more about itself, you can overcome those things, big and small. Nebraska isn't at a place yet where like every mistake, no matter how little or how big, feels insurmountable. Almost as if like it's going to be nearly impossible to overcome that. And so I think that's why it starts to feel very easy to go cherry pick who the blame now falls on. And so that's why for me, and I am going by what Rule has said, where it's like he wants the blame to be put on him and the coaches. And so then my question is, okay, when we get into the off season, let's have those conversations. Let's talk about time management. Let's talk about the just overall approach to protecting the football, making sure that your quarterback isn't running with the ball out like a, just like handing it to somebody for them to take or knock out your hand, or honestly for you to even just hypothetically drop. I mean, these are these little attention to details where it's like these have to be addressed in practice. So you now aren't going to get the bowl game practices, but you'll have time to start working out through winter conditioning, getting ready for spring ball. And when you get into spring ball, how do you start to address these things? Because these are the things that have plagued Nebraska across multiple coaching staffs, and somebody's eventually going to have to fix them. So how do you? And so that's my big question for Matt Rule and the staff is how do you fix these things? How do you ensure that you go into 2024 and you're not worrying about fumbles as much, like just to a healthy amount, not to the amount of we're going to be the most highly fumbled team, like we're fumbling more than anybody else in the Division I level. Like, how do you get yourself to that point? What do you need to be doing now? How are you working on those protection drills in practice? And it's hard to answer right now because like I think what I'm trying to do is process through all of this. And so I hope for those of you who are watching, like I'm trying to make sense of it so that we can move forward. But I think a lot of these questions, unfortunately, are not going to start to be answered until honestly a few months from now when they get into spring football and you can say, talk to us about practice.
Yeah, I mean, you're kind of left to that, and as we know, for practices that are 95% closed, you can kind of say whatever you want to say about practice, that it becomes, well, that's what practice is. Which there's nothing about that's going to change. I mean, I think you hit on it a little bit earlier when you said Iowa knows what it is, and it's not just that it knows what it is; it also is that. And for me, I think that's like the subtle tweak here with Nebraska. To your point of, and a lot of time to discuss this, but like, was there progress here in 2023? I feel very strongly that there was. And the reason why is I think the difference right now with Nebraska is it knows what it wants to be. And I don't know if that was often the case of late. It's not that yet. And a game like this Iowa game, but also some of the others, it really holds a mirror up to that, or it's kind of like a growth chart. And there's kind of nothing there's no way to fast track, I think, sustainable growth would be the phrase that I use there. And we kind of heard that from Rule, whether you liked it, you bought it or not, that's all for everybody to decide individually of, maybe this is just who we are right now. And I think it is. And watching Iowa in this game, like you just see those things where it's like a 15-yard penalty against Nebraska, a questionable one early in the game. You're like, oh boy, that's like a huge leg up for an offense that, really, struggles to produce yards. Not that Nebraska also doesn't. Things like that. The turnovers are obviously easy to note, but even that I think Iowa's second drive where Nebraska had them down inside the 10 or right at the 10. They got like 3 first downs. It only got them to midfield. But I'm, understanding what Iowa is, I watched that and I'm like, wow, that's like a win for Iowa to get it out to midfield. Now they'll punt it deep. Nebraska will have to go right to the field. And Nebraska, those pieces all just don't fit together well enough yet to win games like this consistently. And it would have been nice if they could have got one here for a lot of reasons. They'll get one of them eventually, and we'll see. I mean, there's still a lot to happen this offseason between just recruiting and the transfer portal. But if you ask me right now, I do think this is a team that could that could pop next year. And that's without even knowing like what the roster looks like. It's tough. It's just a feeling, but I do think they made some pretty big gains internally. Just didn't show up on the field and didn't show up in very infuriating and familiar ways.
Yep. And that's, I think, where I can understand frustration and the just like general, like kind of just apathy that people are having right now. And yeah, I can't even sit here and say to anyone like come on, feel differently, because honestly, like at this point, I get it where it's like I saw those comments where it's like it just feels like the same old thing over and over again. And I would say if I'm in the position of any player who's going to be returning next year, if I'm the coaching staff who, whoever returns, and I say that not because I'm necessarily implying anyone is like let go. I'm talking about like Rule even said, with Tony White, like if there's demand and wanting to hire him elsewhere, he's going to be the first to encourage him. So that's why I say it and frame it like that. But I really think that you can look at this as today was the last day of Nebraska in the Big Ten West. 2024 is a new opportunity in so many ways. There's no longer this side of the division that you are playing for. It becomes a completely new ball game for everyone in the Big Ten. So if you're Nebraska, you can really utilize this to your advantage of you're no longer one of the newest members of this conference anymore. You're going to be one of the more tenured, believe it or not, strangely enough, there's a lot of schools who've been in the conference much longer, but I'm just saying you're no longer so much the new kid on the block any longer. You can choose to use this as a fresh start in so many ways. And in some ways, I feel like Nebraska really needs that. Honestly, just a clean slate from everything that the Big Ten has been over the last, 13 years for this program. So that's where like it's going to be a bit of a long off season. It would have been really, really nice to have a bowl game to talk about, but here we are. So the next steps, at least from when we're talking about Counter Read, is we start looking at signing day, which you can expect that at counterread.com and here even on YouTube. We're going to obviously still be covering volleyball. You've got basketball season in full swing for both men and women. Wrestling is off to a really, really hot start. So, we're going to shift our focus until football gets back into the swing of things to start talking about it in the spring. But yeah, we would have loved to have talked about a bowl game, but we just, like everyone else right now, have to now shift our focus, and we will. I think as somebody who said Nebraska was going to be 5-7, I had really hoped I would walk out of this stadium today wrong and that it would have been 6-6. Yet here we are, and it is what it is. So now we have to move forward.
Yeah, I mean, it's you mentioned the conference changing, be another big topic that I'm kind of interested to dig into in the off season, but presents an opportunity for Nebraska. I think it also presents a little different pressure for Nebraska too, because they made big gains, I think, in being the sort of program that could win in the West, and now the West is gone. So if you can be the team, and Nebraska hasn't been, to be clear, be a team that consistently beats the Illinois, Northwestern, Purdue, and is right there with Iowa and Wisconsin, that's great. But starting next season, that means you're maybe sixth best team in the Big Ten, depending on how those Pac-12 teams come. But it's an advantage because Nebraska, as the 12th oldest member of the Big Ten now, or soon to be, it's already processed all that transition, and it's a big transition. And we saw it happen with Nebraska about a decade ago.
Yeah, it's going to be something. That is always what I take from it is it will be something, and we'll be here. So here's the deal. For those of you who are watching, head to counterread.com, become a subscriber. In fact, if you're thinking about becoming a yearly subscriber, now is the time to do it. We're running a Black Friday deal, so don't wait. Whenever you're watching this, don't wait. Head there. You can actually get 50% off of your first year. I'll go ahead and also throw that in the comments of this video if you want to click on it and just head that way. But you can get, again, 50% off of your first year, which is a great deal. We don't intend to run that deal often, likely not until Black Friday of next year. So take advantage of it because, like I said, we're going to be shifting toward a number of things, but that doesn't mean our focus on football ends either. Like there's so many stories to tell and so much to dive into, but there's also, like I said, wrestling to talk about, recruiting to talk about, men's and women's basketball, heck, volleyball. So yeah, head to counterread.com. Go ahead and also like and subscribe to this YouTube channel, because sure, we would all like to have talked about a full game, but we're marching forward and on to the next. But we do appreciate you always tuning in, taking this time with us, letting us just kind of like honestly process our thoughts after these games in almost like real time with you. Go ahead and leave comments, whatever, questions. We'll be back. We'll still do some videos. We're not going to stop these. We'll maybe do some midweek check-ins going forward that are just kind of where things are at, especially with the signing day coming sooner rather than later. Brandon, before I let you go, any final thoughts?
No, I think that pretty well covers it. You mentioned the football piece of it. My problem is I'm kind of never not thinking about college football broadly. So I'm looking forward to the opportunity to turn my attention ever so slightly elsewhere every now and again, but don't worry. I'm always coming up with questions and problems that I like to then go try and solve when it comes to football, specifically Nebraska football.
Hey, that is what we're here for. So go to counterread.com. Also like and subscribe to this YouTube channel. We will be back with plenty more. Thank you as always. Talk to you soon.